everybody, we're going to rewind real fast back to the beginning of the semester with Die Brücke and color. So as many of you may recall, Die Brücke was formed by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Fritz Bleuel, Erich Heckel, and Karl Schmidt-Rudloff in Dresden, Germany in 1905. This was a group of younger generation people who were interested in sharing their lives and their life experiences with each other and to grow artistically together. They were also interested in reacting to current political situations and rebelling against Impressionism. They were very interested in rejuvenating woodcuts. They very much enjoyed the shapes and the textures that they could get from using woodcut. And they were very interested in primitivism, in the primitive art of Africa. I say that quotingly. So that brings us to our modern artist, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, who was born in 1880 and received a degree in architecture, but what he really wanted to do was pursue his woodcuts and his paintings. However, while he was obtaining this degree, he met the other founders of Die Brücke, and that's when they started talking and decided to form Die Brücke in 1905. He received his first artistic recognition through Die Brücke's first large exhibition at Fritz Gerlitz's gallery in 1912, and then he went on to do numerous solo exhibitions. He also loved the liberal arts and he loved to write, and he was largely responsible for the Die Brücke Manifesto. Unfortunately, though, through one of his writings, he was actually responsible for the formal disbanding of Die Brücke. In his Chronique Die Brücke, many of the artists from Die Brücke felt that he was claiming too much credit for the work of the group. In 1914, he was involuntarily volunteered in World War I, and he unfortunately did not fare very well in the army, and his enrollment led to a mental and physical breakdown. He was discharged from the army, but afterwards spent much time in sanatoriums and suffered from paralysis, a persecution complex, and intense anxiety about having to be re-enlisted in the war. Doctors did reassure him that he was too weak mentally and physically to ever be re-enlisted, but he never truly recovered from this breakdown. He later on developed a new style that was not well received and very highly criticized, and he continued to suffer mentally, and he became more and more isolated personally, and tragically he took his own life in 1938. Artistically, he was very inspired by Gauguin and Van Gogh and their use of color and brushwork. And he was exploring thick, rounded brushstrokes initially, and then when he moved from Dresden to Berlin in 1909, his art style kind of shifted, where he thinned out the paint and started using tiny, angular, more nervous strokes in his work, which may have been a result from moving from the country to the city. He liked to use color and distortion and manipulation of form in order to express emotional content. So that brings us to our contemporary artist, Schutz, who was born in 1976 and started painting at the age of 15. She received her MFA at New York's Columbia University in 2002. She's very well versed in art history, and she's also been influenced by Van Gogh and Gauguin, and she loves their use of color and brushwork as well. Also, like Kirchner, she enjoys pushing the limits of color and seeing how two colors can function side by side. She has self-imposed codes of representation, and she needs to know what makes an element worth painting. So she's really exploring form and color and how they can exist together in a meaningful, emotional way. She has a very expressive style, which employs garish and bright color to express emotions and moods, and she also uses altered form. She generally has a dark narrative to her paintings that depict like exotic rituals and culture, and she paints to express her imagination and her thought processes. Speaking in terms of content, her work is very surreal, but her employment of color and her distortion of form reminds me of how De Brücke and Kirchner were exploring new ways of expressing the figure and expressing life situations through new modes that are not impressionistic. She actually doesn't consider herself an abstract painter because she doesn't feel like she has a solid enough ideology behind her forms, but clearly her forms are abstracted and they are manipulated in such a way that is unique. Schutz has been featured in many books, and she's given talks at MoMA and several other galleries all throughout the world and the United States. So that leads us into the comparison section of this presentation. So the first pieces that we have to compare are Kirchner's Laburnum Tree, Curved Bay, and Schutz's Run. And I think the first thing that really pops out is the employment of color and kind of this chaotic space. And we understand that both of them are landscapes, but if you look hard enough, you see the figures that are in both pieces. They both employ a use of bright, vibrant color, which kind of creates this interesting mood of both chaos and energy. And it's really interesting how the two contrast and really complement each other. There is kind of what seems to be more of a sensual narrative in Kirchner's piece, and maybe a little bit more of a ritualistic, dark narrative going on in Schutz's piece. But I find both pieces strikingly similar in the sense of color and the employment of abstracted form and just this kind of chaotic feeling of a composition. But it's still balanced and still works. So the second set of paintings that we're going to talk about is Kirchner's Nude Woman Combing Her Hair and Schutz's Nature Girl. Now right away you can tell that the color schemes used in both of these images is very similar, with the use of yellows and reds and greens and blacks. But we also notice that the female character is the central, most important character, and sometimes the only character, as in the Nature Girl. However, the scenery around both of the women in both of these images is very abstracted, but it's very interesting and it's very idealized as far as color. And there's kind of this importance that is being placed on both of these women in both of these images, which is not only being reinforced by color, but it's also being reinforced by form and their central placement in the composition. The next comparison that we're going to make is between Kirchner's Franzi before a carved stool and Schutz's Happy. Right away we can tell that both of these paintings are very abstracted and they make use of idealized and emotional colors, and both of them have backgrounds that have been highly stylized and colorized and are actually appear very close to the figure. There's not a lot of depth into the picture plane. And another thing that I find really interesting about both of these images is their faces seem, and even their bodies, they seem very false, very mask-like it's a covering for a figure or its allusion to a face more than an actual representation of a face. Especially in Schutz's Happy, where there's just these kind of simplified eyes and mouth, and I can't even tell if there's a nose. It's barely an implication of it. Where in Kirchner's we have more defined mouth and eyes and nose, but it still feels like a mask or a covering. The next comparison we're going to make is by two self-portraits by the respective artists, the one on the left being Kirchner, the one on the right being Schutz. They are both in the process of painting. One thing that I think is very, very interesting is the fact that they use colors that mimic nature, like the peaches and the pinks and skin tones, but it still is away from nature. It's still an abstraction and interpretation of nature. While Kirchner's piece has almost a lack of shading, Schutz's piece does have more in-depth shading. However, I think that for me the most important thing is this use of color and this use and conveyance of form through non-naturalistic ways. The last comparison we're going to make is between Kirchner's Potsdamer Platz and Schutz's The Breeders. Right away you can tell the color scheme is different, but I still notice that there's really two main central characters with very simplified features, very abstracted backgrounds, and both images use color effectively. On the left side in Kirchner's piece, I feel like it's kind of a sickly feeling, and on the right side in The Breeders, it's kind of more daylight, it's kind of more shining, but there's kind of this weird, eerie darkness to it. I feel like both pieces, due to their color composition and abstraction, have an eeriness about them. They kind of play with this perspective and this form in such a way that makes you really think about what is really being communicated here. And I feel like there's kind of an illness to both of these images, and I'm basing that solely on color and form and composition. In conclusion, we see that both Kirchner and Schutz use color and form in abstracted and interesting, bold ways, in ways that are non-naturalistic, but they convey emotions and they generate moods, and they really convey something to the viewer outside of naturalistic conveyance. Thank you very much for watching my presentation. I really hope you enjoyed it. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, please email me. Thanks for watching.